The date is January 1974. The location is the Karelian Isthmus, a frozen, desolate stretch of land separating the Soviet Union from Finland. For the border guards of the KGB and the elite trackers of the Spetsnaz, this wilderness is supposed to be an impenetrable wall. It is the edge of the Iron Curtain. Every inch of snow is monitored by patrols, guard dogs, and seismic sensors. The Soviet doctrine is clear. Any invasion will come with the roar of tank engines or the scream of jet turbines. War is loud, war is heavy, war is visible on radar screens hundreds of miles away. But on this particular night, a report lands on the desk of a senior GRU intelligence officer in Moscow that defies the fundamental laws of nuclear physics as the Soviets understand them. The report does not come from a radar station. It does not come from a satellite intercept. It comes from a deep cover asset observing NATO winter warfare exercises in the Bavarian Alps. The asset describes a unit of American soldiers, elite operators, moving with a speed and stealth that should be impossible for men carrying heavy weaponry. They are not carrying rifles alone. They are not carrying mortars. They are hauling a specific, canvas-wrapped cylinder, strapped to the back of a single man, skiing down a black diamond slope at 40 miles per hour. To the Soviet analyst reading the report, the description reads like a hallucination. The asset claims this single canister, no larger than a heavy rucksack, contains the power to vaporize a mountain pass. Confusion reigns in the intelligence directorate. The Soviet nuclear program, mighty as it is, operates on the principle of mass. Their warheads are heavy. Their delivery systems are massive intercontinental ballistic missiles or supersonic bombers like the Tu-95. To make a nuclear device small enough to be carried by a single infantryman, without a vehicle, without a launch crew, and without a power supply, is technically viewed as a fantasy. It is the stuff of science fiction, not military reality. The initial reaction inside the Kremlin's Defense Committee is skepticism bordering on mockery. They suspect it is a psychological operation, a bluff designed to make the Red Army chase ghosts in the snow. How could the Americans shrink the apocalypse down to the size of a suitcase? If a man trips while skiing, does he wipe out a city? The physics don't add up. The shielding alone required for a nuclear core should crush a man's spine. Yet, the reports keep coming. Strange movements near critical infrastructure in West Germany. Patterns of American special operations training that mimic stay-behind sabotage missions, but with security protocols reserved for nuclear weapons storage sites. The pieces of the puzzle do not fit the picture of conventional war. The Soviets are looking for an army, but the intelligence points to something far more terrifying: a ghost. If you want to uncover the hidden history of the Cold War's most dangerous standoffs, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We act as your declassified clearance to the stories they didn't want you to know. The stakes of this anomaly suddenly skyrocket. The Soviet defensive strategy in Europe relies entirely on the concept of the front. They have massed thousands of T-62 and T-72 tanks to smash through the Fulda Gap. They have layers of 75 and S-125 surface-to-air missiles to scour the skies. Their entire military worldview is focused on stopping a sledgehammer blow from the west. But if this intelligence is true, if this phantom weapon actually exists, the front line is irrelevant. The GRU analysts begin to run simulations, and the results are catastrophic. If a single man can carry a tactical nuclear weapon across a frozen river or parachute into a forest clearing unnoticed, the entire rear echelon of the Warsaw Pact is defenseless. The massive logistical hubs, the rail yards moving Soviet armor, the command bunkers buried deep in East Germany, all of them are vulnerable to a threat they cannot see on radar. Panic begins to seep into the strategic planning meetings. The Soviet generals realize they are prepared for World War III, but they are not prepared for a single skier in the dark. They have built a fortress with high walls, but they have no idea how to stop a killer who is already inside the house. The questions multiply. Is it a dummy warhead? Is it a chemical weapon disguised as a nuke? Or have the Americans achieved a breakthrough in critical mass physics that Soviet scientists have missed entirely? The Spetsnaz, the Soviet Union's own special forces, are tasked with a new, urgent directive. Find the ghosts. Find the men with the heavy backpacks. But as the winter of 1974 drags on, the Soviet hunter-killer teams find nothing but snow. The object described in the spy reports remains a myth, a terrifying variable that threatens to turn the Red Army's numerical superiority into ash. They are hunting a weapon that shouldn't exist, wielded by men who leave no trace. The investigation begins not with a bang, but with a terrifying silence in the deep woods of Europe. The investigation begins in the grey, brutalist corridors of the GRU headquarters in Moscow, known as the Aquarium. The order comes down from the highest levels of the Politburo: identify the device, identify the carriers, and determine if the Americans have truly broken the laws of physics. For the Spetsnaz brigade stationed in East Germany, this order translates into a frantic, high-stakes manhunt. Their commanders, hardened veterans who train to fight entire NATO battalions, are suddenly obsessed with finding two-man hiking teams. They begin to scrutinize every piece of intelligence coming out of American training centers in Fort Bragg and Bad Tolz. They are looking for the logistical tail that must exist. In the Soviet military doctrine, a nuclear weapon is a distinct, heavy beast. It requires a convoy. It requires security trucks. It requires a team of physicists and engineers to arm it. The Spetsnaz intelligence officers scour aerial reconnaissance photos of West German forests, looking for these support signatures. They find nothing. There are no security convoys. There are no radiation containment trucks parked in the tree line. There are only grainy photographs of American soldiers, looking casually exhausted, ruck-marching through the mud. This absence of evidence begins to build a terrifying legend within the Soviet ranks. Whispers begin to circulate among the Spetsnaz officers about the green light teams. The rumor is that these men are not soldiers in the traditional sense, but suicidal ghosts. The Soviets cannot comprehend how a soldier could be expected to detonate a nuclear weapon at close range. In the Red Army, nuclear war is something executed by generals pushing buttons in bunkers, not by a sergeant crouching under a bridge. The paranoia deepens. Soviet counterintelligence begins to harass and interrogate anyone with connections to NATO's winter warfare schools. They are desperate for specs. How much does it weigh? What is the yield? One report from 1976 describes a Soviet attaché in Switzerland frantically trying to purchase a specific type of American climbing rope, believing that the tensile strength of the rope would reveal the weight of the phantom bomb. If the rope was rated for 300 pounds, they reasoned the bomb must be heavy. If it was standard rope, the bomb was impossibly light. The confusion leads to dangerous, incorrect conclusions. Inside the Kremlin, a faction of old guard generals refuses to believe the miniaturization is possible. They argue that the backpacks are actually sophisticated radio beacons targeting computers designed to guide incoming missiles or airstrikes. They convince themselves that the Americans are playing a shell game. "It is a spotter," one general reportedly argued during a strategy session. "They plant the box, they run away, and a Lance missile hits the target. No man carries the sun in his rucksack." This theory gains traction because it is comforting. It fits the Soviet understanding of war. It implies that there is still a delay, a window of time between the device being planted and the explosion. It implies that if the Spetsnaz can jam the radio signal, they can stop the detonation. They are dangerously wrong. While the Soviets waste millions of rubles developing jamming equipment and hunting for non-existent missile batteries, they fail to grasp the terrifying reality of the technology facing them. They assume the device is complex, requiring codes and remote signals. They project their own bureaucratic limitations onto their enemy. They cannot imagine that the Americans have delegated the power of a Hiroshima-style event to a 25-year-old lieutenant with a simple mechanical timer. The investigation hits a wall of silence. The Spetsnaz increase their patrols along the Iron Curtain. They begin to treat every NATO exercise as a potential nuclear insertion. The tension is palpable. A stray hiker near a sensitive radar installation is no longer just a nuisance. He is treated as a potential existential threat. But the most disturbing aspect for the Soviet investigators is the silence of the physics. Their own nuclear scientists at Arzamas 16 are tasked with replicating the alleged device. They struggle. To shrink the fissile material down to the size of a coffee can while maintaining critical mass requires distinct, precision machining and explosive lens technology that the Soviet industrial base struggles to mass produce. If the Soviets cannot build it, how can the Americans have it deployed in the field? By the late 1970s, the mystery has festered into a strategic nightmare. The Spetsnaz know something is out there. They call it the satchel charge from hell. But because they cannot find a physical specimen, and because they refuse to believe the Americans would entrust tactical nukes to skiers, they prepare for the wrong war. They reinforce their tanks against missile strikes. They harden their bunkers against air raids. They leave the back doors, the culverts, the sewer grates, the frozen streams unguarded against the single man with the heavy pack. They are looking for a dragon, unaware that the threat is a virus. While the Spetsnaz were chasing shadows in the Bavarian forests and the GRU was wasting rubles trying to jam non-existent radio signals, the truth was sitting quietly in a secure weapons storage locker in Hanau, West Germany. The American solution to the massive Soviet tank advantage was not a bigger tank. It was a triumph of miniaturization that defied the era's engineering norms. It was the W-54 warhead, the heart of the Special Atomic Demolition Munition, known simply by its acronym SADM. To understand the sheer audacity of this project, you have to look at the timeline. In the 1950s, nuclear weapons were the size of cars. By the early 1960s, American physicists at Los Alamos had achieved a breakthrough in implosion geometry that allowed them to shrink the physics package down to a cylinder roughly 12 inches in diameter and 16 inches long. This wasn't a theoretical prototype, it was a ruggedized, combat-ready device. The resulting weapon system, the B-54, weighed approximately 160 pounds inside its fiberglass transport case. It was heavy, brutal to carry, but it was undeniably man-portable. A single soldier, if he was strong enough, could strap the apocalypse to his back and walk away. The ingenuity lay not just in the physics, but in the operational doctrine known as green light. The US Army and Navy SEALs selected only the most elite operators for these teams. These men were screened for psychological stability far beyond the norm. They were being asked to carry a weapon that could vaporize a city block, trek deep behind enemy lines, and arm it by hand. The training took place in total secrecy. In the snowy peaks near Bad Tölz and deep underwater in the Caribbean, these teams practiced the impossible. They learned to parachute from aircraft at 30,000 feet, high-altitude, low-opening jumps while strapped to the canister. They learned to ski down black diamond slopes with the device pulling at their center of gravity. They learned to swim into enemy harbors, with the weapon tethered to them like a dark twin. The brilliance of the American strategy was that it turned the Soviet strength into a weakness. The Soviets relied on the choke points of Europe, the narrow valleys, the mountain tunnels, and the bridges that their thousands of T-62 tanks needed to cross to invade the West. The SADM was not designed to target Moscow. It was designed to target geography. The plan was surgical and terrifyingly simple. If the balloon went up and the Red Army surged across the border, green light teams would stay behind. They would wait in holes in the ground while the Soviet tank divisions rolled past them. Then, under the cover of darkness, they would emerge. They would ski or hike to a pre-selected target, a dam, a tunnel, or a mountain pass. They would unlock the control panel on the device. There were no radio signals to jam, no remote triggers to intercept. The mechanism was mechanical and manual. It required a specific code and 2 men to turn the keys. They would set the timer, which could run from minutes to hours, and then they would run. The ingenuity here was the complete removal of the delivery vehicle. The Soviets had built the world's best air defense network. Their 75 missiles could shoot down a U-2 spy plane at 60,000 feet. Their radar could spot a bomber taking off in England. But they had absolutely no defense against 2 guys in snow camouflage simply walking through the woods. The device itself was a masterpiece of Cold War engineering. It had a variable yield, capable of being dialed from 10 tons of TNT equivalent up to 1 kiloton, roughly the power of 1,000 heavy aircraft bombs exploding at once. It was enough to turn a mountain into a landslide that would block a Soviet armored column for weeks. While the Soviet generals argued over whether it was a missile spotter or a myth, American sergeants were running drills on how to assemble the firing train in freezing mud with numb fingers. The Americans had fundamentally changed the geometry of the battlefield. They had decoupled the nuclear threat from the missile silo. This was the secret that the Spetsnaz could not find. They were looking for a weapon of war, but the Americans had built a tool of sabotage. The SADM was invisible, not because it used stealth technology, but because it looked like a rucksack. It hid in plain sight. The American dominance in this sector wasn't just about having better atoms, it was about having the imagination to put those atoms on the back of a skier. The fog of confusion finally lifted in the late 1970s, not through a radar blip, but through the acquisition of hard paper intelligence. Soviet spies operating within NATO logistics chains finally pieced together the full operational manual for the green light teams. The confrontation took place in a closed-door session of the General Staff in Moscow. The intelligence dossier was laid out, and the theory of the radio beacon was dismantled page by page. The photographs and technical schematics confirmed the grim reality. The Americans had not built a spotter. They had built a standalone, fully functional nuclear weapon that did not require a command link to the President of the United States once it was deployed. The shock moment that rippled through the room was the realization of the delegation of authority. In the Soviet system, nuclear weapons were the jealously guarded prerogative of the supreme leadership. The idea that a 20-something-year-old American sergeant, shivering in a foxhole in Bavaria, possessed the physical key and the mechanical timer to initiate a nuclear detonation was inconceivable to the Soviet mind. The report detailed the specifics of the SADM. It revealed that the device used a mechanical combination lock, similar to a bank vault, and a wind-up timer. It was analog. It was unstoppable by electronic jamming. It was immune to EMP. But the true horror for the Soviet strategists was the tactical implication. They looked at their maps of the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain. For decades, they had calculated the speed of their tank advance based on enemy resistance. Now they realized that every bridge, every tunnel, and every narrow valley road they planned to use could be turned into a radioactive crater by two men who had been hiding there for days. The green light teams were not just soldiers, they were human landmines. The revelation forced a frantic and futile response. The Soviet military-industrial complex, stung by the technological gap, scrambled to build their own version. They developed the RA-115 and RA-115-01 special mines. These were the Soviet suitcase nukes that would later become the subject of so many terrifying post-Cold War legends. However, the Soviet response failed to match the American capability for two critical reasons. First, the technology was inferior. The Soviet portable nukes were reportedly heavier, more temperamental, and required frequent maintenance to keep the core stable. They were not the rugged, throw-it-in-a-jeep devices the Americans had perfected. Second, and more importantly, the Soviets could not overcome their own paranoia. While the Americans trusted their elite troops with the weapon, the Soviet leadership did not. The RA-115 units were kept under such heavy lock and key, often requiring codes held only in Moscow, that they were tactically useless. The Soviets built the weapon, but refused to build the trust required to use it. The Soviets also attempted to counter the American threat by creating specialized, anti-sabotage Spetsnaz hunter-killer groups. They diverted massive resources to guarding rear-area infrastructure. Every bridge in East Germany had to be watched. Every culvert had to be checked. The mere existence of the SADM forced the Red Army to look over its shoulder constantly, slowing down their offensive tempo before the first shot was even fired. The most chilling realization came when Soviet analysts calculated the survival rate of the American teams. The SADM manuals spoke of evacuation planning, but the math was brutal. If a team set the timer for the standard delay and tried to ski away, they would likely still be within the lethal thermal radiation zone or the shockwave radius when the device went off. The Soviets realized they were facing men who were effectively willing to execute suicide missions to stop the Red Army. This shattered the Soviet propaganda narrative that American soldiers were soft, capitalist consumers who lacked the will to fight. The discovery of the backpack nuke proved that their enemy was willing to embrace mutually assured destruction at a personal, individual level. The mystery was solved, but the solution offered no comfort. The ghosts in the woods were real. They were carrying the sun in their backpacks, and they were waiting for the tanks to roll. The verdict of history is often decided not by the weapons that are fired, but by the weapons that are feared. By 1989, the Iron Curtain was crumbling, and the Cold War was ending. In the final accounting of this decades-long standoff, the special atomic demolition munition stands as the ultimate example of asymmetric dominance. The killer statistic is not a death toll, for the SADM was never detonated in anger. The statistic is the ratio of investment to paralysis. The United States produced approximately 300 W-54 warheads for the SADM program. The Soviet Union produced over 50,000 tanks and armored vehicles to conquer Europe. Yet, in every war game ran by the Warsaw Pact in the 1980s, those 50,000 tanks were held hostage by 300 backpacks. The mere existence of the weapon forced the Soviet planners to assume that every major logistical artery was already severed before the war began. It forced them to allocate thousands of Spetsnaz troops to rear-area security instead of offensive sabotage. The return on investment for the United States was infinite. For the price of a few hundred rucksacks and the bravery of a few hundred men, they had mentally crippled the largest armored force on the planet. This technological victory highlighted the fatal flaw in the Soviet system, a flaw that went far deeper than circuit boards or uranium enrichment. It was a failure of ideology. The SADM was a weapon of trust. To make it work, the American military had to hand the keys to the apocalypse to a Sergeant E5. They had to trust that he would not detonate it accidentally. They had to trust that he would not sell it. They had to trust that he would follow orders even when cut off from command. The American system, for all its faults, was built on the concept of the empowered individual. The Soviet Union could not replicate this. They managed to build their own portable nukes, the RA-115 suitcases, but they could not deploy them effectively because the Soviet state fundamentally feared its own citizens. A Soviet soldier with a nuclear weapon in his backpack was seen by the Kremlin not as a strategic asset, but as a security risk. Their rigidity, their centralization, and their paranoia meant that even when they stole the technology, they could not steal the doctrine required to use it. The economic impact was equally devastating. While the US pursued miniaturization and smart lethality, the Soviet Union kept building bigger, heavier, and more expensive industrial dinosaurs. The SADM was a microcosm of the entire Cold War economy, American innovation rendering Soviet mass production obsolete. The Soviets bankrupted themselves, building an armada of T-72 tanks and MiG-29 aircraft to fight a war that had already moved beyond simple steel and fire. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell, the SADM program was quietly retired. The tactical need for them vanished with the threat of a Soviet invasion. The weapons were dismantled. The nuclear cores were recycled. The green light teams were disbanded, their members returning to the shadows of the special operations community, their stories sealed in classified folders for decades. But the legacy of the backpack nuke refuses to die. In the chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union, General Alexander Lebed, a former fierce critic of the Soviet system, claimed that dozens of the Soviet-made RA-115 suitcase nukes were unaccounted for. Whether this was truth or political theater remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 1990s. It is a dark irony that the Soviet copy, built in paranoia, became the source of the modern world's greatest nuclear terror, the fear of the loose nuke. Today, the concept of a soldier carrying a nuclear weapon seems like a fever dream from a bygone era. It belongs to a time when the world was divided into black and white, and when the line between bravery and madness was drawn in the snow of the Bavarian Alps. The SADM remains the most terrifying testament to American Cold War ingenuity. It proved that you did not need a missile the size of a skyscraper to hold the world at bay. You just needed the physics of a dying star and a man willing to carry the weight. The Soviets spent 40 years watching the sky for bombers, never realizing that the real threat was walking quietly through the woods, waiting for the green light.